So I'm back, and we just finished up the causes and the effects of the French and Indian War. So now we're going to talk about the second cause of the American Revolution, which was the taxing of the colonists. And as we are doing this, I am going to be reading pages from the book called King George, What Was His Problem? So, just so you know, the reason why King George decided to tax the colonists was because war was not cheap. And they had just ended the French and Indian War, and they were in debt, which means that they didn't have any more money to spend, and they needed money, especially for the colonies. So the prime minister at the time, named George Grenville, that it would be a good idea to tax the colonists. He felt that they should pay taxes to Britain because Britain was the one that really helped them to win that war against the French and the Indian and the Native Americans. So what he came up with was the first act was called the Stamp Act, okay, the stamp tax. So basically, what that meant was, it was set up in 1765, so that was 2 years after the French and Indian War had ended. When a colonist signed any kind of legal document, or if they bought any kind of paper good like newspaper or book, playing cards, even stamps, paper, and envelopes for when they wanted to write home to family or friends, they would get taxed. Now, this angered a lot of colonists, especially in Boston. And what they wound up doing, once they found out that they were going to start getting taxed, and that there was going to be a tax collector from Great Britain living in their town in Boston, they decided that they needed to make it stop before it could even begin. So they came up with the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Basically, what that meant was they were not going to pay that tax. So, saying it is one thing, but actually doing something about it is completely different. So, Samuel Adams, who lived in Boston, had an idea in which they would go to so they created a doll that looked like the tax collector, Andrew Oliver, who lived in Boston at the time, with a note pinned to him, okay, hanging from a tree branch. The doll was hanging from a tree branch, and it had a note pinned to it that said, "What greater joy did New England see than a stamp man hanging on a tree?" Now, Andrew Oliver took that as a threat, as well as other tax collectors in other colonies also felt threatened by this, and they left, and they went and lived on an island away from the colonists. So once this tax was supposed to go into effect, nobody was there to collect them. So the colonists thought they had won. But then what happened was that Mr. King George was furious about this. So he wound up getting rid of the Stamp Act, and he put into place the Townshend Acts of 1767. So what this means is, when colonial merchants, okay, people that were buying and selling things in other countries, on other continents, and they were, the ones that were building or making things, when they had things imported, which means that those things came from overseas. So imported think inside, okay? So something is being imported, it's coming into the country. And if it's being exported, it is leaving the country. So some of these things that they were starting to be taxed on was paint, tea, which was very important to the English, also to the colonists. The colonists loved tea. So this had a huge impact on them. Also paper and glass. So whenever they want to buy these things, they have to pay a tax based on the value of each item. So rather than paying the new taxes, colonists, especially the women, were boycotting. And to boycott means refuse to buy. They were refusing to pay these, okay? They were boycotting it. They were boycotting buying the British goods that were being sent in. Now, John Hancock, who he found another way to get around paying the taxes, which he snuck in a lot of the goods. Now, smuggling at this time in the colonies was illegal. Okay, if you were caught, you were thrown in jail. Okay, now when the British soldiers were trying to have order in these colonies, a lot of them were afraid. And there was one in particular named John Malcolm who was actually stripped down to the waist. Okay, so the colonists removed his shirt and they tarred him. Okay, they put on this like really hot tar, which they use on rooftops. And they took feathers from a pillow and stuck them to him. And then, number one, he was humiliated, but number two, it was really, really painful. And when he went back to England, he couldn't, he removed skin. Some skin was removed as he was taking it off. So it was very painful. And this was like a really intense message from the colonists to Britain. And it really angered King George. Really angered him a lot. Okay, he did not appreciate that type of protest. So then what happened was in 1768, British warships sailed into the Boston Harbor under General Thomas Gage. Now, 1,000 British soldiers marched off the ships and paraded through the town in their red coats, beating drums and dragging cannons. Now, that should have intimidated the colonists, but it really didn't. So, in March of 1770, March 2nd to be exact, a British soldier named Patrick Walker was looking for a little extra work in Boston. Now, the British soldiers weren't really paid that much, so when they needed to find extra work, they really did look for it, and they took an opportunity. And okay, so he actually so he was looking for work, and then he was attacked by a group of colonists who started to hit him with clubs like bats. And actually, the British soldiers, they also had bats. So they were starting to hit them, and it became like a full-fledged event. And this is what they call the shot heard around the world. Because what happened was this man named Atticus, Crispus Attucks, who was very, very tall, and he was actually an African American who was freed. He went into the crowd, and a British soldier shot him. shot and killed him. And they were put on trial. Okay, it became a huge, huge thing. And they were actually found not guilty, which infuriated the colonists so much more. Now, then in December of 1773, there was the Boston Tea Party. And what this was, colonists who were infuriated with the fact that there was still tax on the tea, and they absolutely loved drinking tea. They decided, so they dressed up like Native Americans, and they went on to the British ships where they had their tea and threw it all into the harbor, basically letting the British know, letting King George know that they were not going to pay these taxes. So this really, really infuriated, really made King George mad. And what he came up with finally was what the colonists nicknamed the Intolerable Acts of 1774. So the British soldiers closed the Boston port. Now, this really, really hurt the Boston economy, because, as you know, when we learned about the New England colonies, when we were learning about the 13 colonies, their economy was based on trading, fishing, and also shipping. Also, stores were shut down, and a lot of the jobs disappeared. So then what happened was colonists who weren't really into politics started taking sides. So anybody who was a patriot was opposed to the British taxes, and they stood by Boston. And a loyalist was somebody who supported the king. So, as you can imagine, this caused a lot of problems in Boston. Okay, so because they started taking sides, a group of men decided that they were going to create their own army, which they called the Continental Army. And 1775 is when the American Revolution officially began. So we have finished talking about all the reasons why the American Revolution began. And we will then be moving on to talking about the different people who had an impact on the war. And make sure that you are filling out your interactive student notebook pages with the information that I just gave, along with the those of you that are doing the